I'll try to tell you briefly a little bit about me, kind of my early life history, and we'll see what goes from there. Anyway, so yeah, I was born in Northern Ontario, Hearst, it's called, and up there in Northern Ontario, just 100 or so kilometers south of James Bay, along Highway 11, I think it's called. And I was born disabled, physically disabled. They weren't sure if I was mentally disabled because they had no way of knowing. I mean, you don't really show that you're intelligent or not until a little bit later on. My legs were deformed, my hips were deformed, my feet were deformed, my elbows were messed up, my wrists were messed up. Above the shoulders, things seemed fine. The knees seemed more or less okay, and the shoulders seemed more or less okay. But other stuff, they weren't sure what was going on. They were trying to figure out if I was disabled in the head. And my mother said, well, no, he's not, because, he gets upset at the sound of the clothesline, and he, kind of jerks his head, and it bugs him, and, so I don't think there's anything wrong with him from that perspective. So they figure, oh, okay, so je pense qu'il doit être okay, parce que là, ça dérange la ligne de close, hein? Because in Northern Ontario, they speak the French and they speak the English. So there's a bit of English going on and a bit of French going on at the time, I guess, in the hospital. I was the youngest of 5 kids. My mother had already had 4 others. They figured I should get baptized. So I guess the Monsignor, priest, came to the hospital, did a baptism. So I was apparently baptized on May the 4th. So they tried to figure out how to get me from Hearst to Toronto. And they got me from Hearst to Kapuskasing. And some of the aunts and uncles got on a plane and flew me down to Toronto, I guess. And then they got me into the hospital for sick children, which I think was around May 11th. And I got checked in. And the doctors were trying to deal with what the situation was. Ils savaient pas du tout qu'est-ce qui se passait. Le médecin, il savait pas. Il avait aucune idée. Personne savent. But they figured out that it was just in the joints. There was nothing wrong inside the organs. They poked and prodded, pushed and pulled and do all the kinds of things doctors do. Everything inside seemed to have been in the right place. So there's well, it looks like it's just an outside thing. There was a thing called club feet. So they knew what club feet was, and club feet was a thing that you could fix. But they said, well, you don't have club feet in your hands. You don't have club feet in your hips. And at that point, they'd figured out that, well, I'd actually had the dislocated hips on both sides, and they'd done a bunch of x-rays, and they figured out, well, there was a bunch of stuff that was wrong everywhere. And somewhere in there, they figured out it was what's called arthrogryposis multiplex congenita. And like I always say to anybody who's listening, if you can say it, you can have it. Arthrogryposis multiplex congenita. So arthrogryposis means stiff joints, basically. So I had what they called stiff joints. It was a description more than it was anything else. The description was kind of a Greek, Latin kind of name, I suppose is what you would call it. Helped you figure out what it was, helped them figure out what to do. So they started looking at it, did some surgeries, they put some casts on, thinking that would straighten things out, and it didn't. So then I guess they started looking at surgery options, and the doctors who were assigned to my case started consulting with each other about what to do. And, that was interesting. At that point, in Ontario, there was no Medicare, there was no healthcare, there was no federal healthcare, there was no provincial healthcare, there was no nothing. And they're like, what are you going to do? My parents lived in Northern Ontario. My dad, at that time, I believe, was not working, or he was working for the Ontario Northern Railway. So it's kind of hard to figure out what was going on back then. So they basically looked at the situation and said, well, look, hospital, we got to start doing some surgery here because we figure that there's something wrong with the tendons, because the tendons seem to be stopping the bones from growing correctly. So we need to get in there and do some work on the tendons and rebuild the joints. And it's going to be a lot of surgery here. So we're not going to charge the hospital. We're not going to charge the parents for this. It'd be nice if you didn't charge too much for all the time he's going to be in the hospital. So at the end of the day being 13, I had had my last operation in the hospital. I turned 13. I had had 36 operations in the hospital. I spent a lot of time in the hospital. My sister Elise had written a scrapbook, and it had pictures of me growing up in the hospital that they had taken. And she said that by the time I was 9, I spent half my life in the hospital. So by the time I was 13, I suspect I spent even a proportionate amount of time in the hospital. So I have a lot of stories about growing up and hospital time and that kind of stuff. So I think that's what these stories are going to be the from that time growing up, a little bit in Northern Ontario, where I never really lived, and then moving down to Stratford, Ontario, and growing up there. And then 13 when we moved to Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island, and I had no more surgery. So there you go. I think my 5 minutes is up, and we'll see you at the next video. Cheers.